Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Psychology. We're going to begin with a quick overview of why we should look at psychology and what does it mean for us, and why is it considered to be a core science that's organized around other core sciences like physics and mathematics and even history, for example. The prologue of this textbook opens up with a couple of examples of why psychology is relevant in a modern sense or even a contemporary sense, and it opens up with how we are living in a digital age, and living in that digital age we realize that there are deep fake videos and audio files that are changing the way we perceive information and how we see other people. And this is important because a few examples that the book points out is how celebrities are being targeted for deepfake videos, their audio files are being manipulated, and they're appearing in adult rated R films. Other examples are surrounding politicians, and politicians are being portrayed one way when their behavior is truly a different way. And what that simply means is that you have a politician that has noble aims for what they want to do in office, but because somebody else doesn't want them to actually be in office, they'll manipulate the audio and video files. That way mainstream people in their district, or even in America for that matter, will view that person rather poorly. Another example that has even more real world implications is taking a particular head of state, and a person that's the head of state commands a lot of power given the office that they occupy. And a likely scenario they said that has to do with deepfake videos is, imagine if this person's narrative was manipulated in a video and also audio file, and they then said that they launched a nuclear war on a particular state, and as a result of that, it sparked not only a nuclear war, but also a third world war. This is the time that we're living in, and we have to be able to critique information fairly and try to understand that everything that we see online may not be real because of deep fake videos and so forth. One other example is how people constantly compare themselves and find themselves getting sad and even depressed at times when they look at social networking sites like Facebook. And I think we've all been there. And it also says how people's relationships with people that they used to spend time with in their local neighborhoods is starting to decline. And what that simply means is that people are now starting to live more vicariously through the lives of other people rather than actually getting together to talk, hang out, maybe even break bread and share a meal together like they used to. I can certainly relate to that example as well. So psychology is relevant for all of us because it's the study of thought and its behavior. And psychology is rooted in the ancient tradition of Greece and the philosophical thought process that emerges from that culture. And the word psychology can be broken up into two parts. Psycho meaning mind, spirit, soul, and logi meaning the study of. So in essence, from the Greek tradition of the word, it's the study of the mind, spirit, and soul. And psychology will be defined as the study of human thought and also behavior. And of course, there's also a pop psychology that the book talks about, and that's just simply to say, as an example I'd like to provide, group of girls get together, they're all married, they go to Starbucks, they're having coffee, they're enjoying each other's company, and then they're analyzing their significant others and they're wondering, why do they appear so self-interested, selfish, maybe even narcissistic? And they talk about these various things. Now, they're not clinicians, they're not really applying psychology in the sense of the way this book will explain it to you. But it's meant to say that psychology can truly be a pop psychology where people talk about it in the mainstream as a very matter of fact, when in fact they're really not sure how to use the various terms and disciplines associated with it. We even find that psychology is a core science, and what that typically means is that as a core science, psychology is organized around other subject matter. And as such, you find that history, physics, mathematics, and so forth have a vested interest in understanding psychology. If you take, for example, literature, literature is important because it's the art of storytelling. You have an antagonist, you have a protagonist, you're trying to decide what type of behaviors and thinking process this character is going to have. And you start to develop the character, and as a result of that, you come up with a very interesting plot. It makes for a great thriller or a suspense novel, for example, and who even knows, maybe it turns into a Hollywood film. And we also recognize that history, when it's used to describe people's past actions, relies on artifacts and the written word to try to understand why people are the way they are. A real good example there is when they try to develop an understanding of why Adolf Hitler or even Joseph Stalin were so evil in the 20th century, based on many of the things that they did against people and even the global citizens of the world. And the point here is that even anthropologists have a vested interest in understanding people because it's about the origin of people and also its culture. And when you take all these different disciplines and you start to apply it to psychology, you start to realize that all these fields are actually interrelated. As a result of that, we have well over 24 various subdisciplines in psychology, with clinical psychology being the largest on this pie graph. Interestingly, there are more PhDs in psychology now than other core subjects. And another interesting fact is that 71% of women are actually earning psychology PhDs, more so than men. And that's an interesting fact to keep in mind. Psychology is interesting for me because it's about the human condition and it's about the story of us. And as a result of that, it allows us to ask provocative questions, making assumptions that could be wrong, by the way, if we don't follow the scientific method, which we'll learn about it in Chapter 2. And it allows us to better understand ourselves and also understand the interactions we have with other people and people that we're just observing from a distance. And again, we're not always right about our assumptions, but nevertheless, we're not always wrong either. We're going to go into the origin of psychology to get a better understanding, because psychology not only grows out of the root, or I should say the main vein of philosophical thought, but it's also regarded as both a practice and a science. And the practice of psychology has been around for a long time. If we look at the Stone Age, 7,000 to 50,000 years ago, for example, we see that there were shamans. And shamans were medicine doctors that were both male and female. And they were important to the culture because they would conjure up a potion. They would use incantations, prayers, and sometimes even exorcisms to exorcise a demon out of a person, largely because they felt the person's thinking or maybe even their outward behavior was a little odd. So we find shamans or medicine doctors being important. Now, the image that you see up here of a skull with a hole on it is referred to as a surgical procedure that was done by shamans in the Stone Age. And this is referred to as trepanation. Trepanation basically just implies that a rudimentary tool or surgical tool during this time period was used to carve out a 1-inch diameter from the person's head to remove the skull. And sometimes, even when the tools were not very good, they would use another tool just to scrape at the surface of the skull until you can actually remove a portion of it. Interestingly, the archaeological evidence suggests by researchers that people did survive after trepanation. Of course, some died too, but there were people that actually survived this surgery, and that's because of bone growth that has been observed after the surgery, which implies that the people were able to survive long after that. And of course, people that were in a coma may not have survived, but they could have actually come out of a coma after this surgical procedure that was conducted. But why would shamans conduct this type of surgical procedure? Well, two thoughts the book brings up. The first one, if a person sustains an injury to the head, the brain can swell. As a result of that, a person would have trepidation occur where they remove a portion of the skull in an effort to relieve some of the pressure that's building up in the brain. The other area is if the person's behavior was quite odd and strange and they couldn't figure it out, they would then go to great lengths to try to exorcise the demon out of them. And part of that process was to remove a little piece of the skull, and that way the spirit or the demon can actually leave the person. That was the other reason that they would do it. Now, in a modern sense, we know that the first reason certainly makes sense, because if somebody gets into a car accident and suffers any type of brain injury or brain trauma, one of the first things that the surgeons will do is open up the skull to relieve the pressure. So it's very likely that these are two reasons that trepanation would actually occur in this during the Stone Age. We also realized that our ancient views of being supernatural, for example, would start to evolve and they would start to shift and change. And what that simply means is that they move away from supernatural explanations and more into an organic explanation or rooted in some type of physiological issue that's taken place. And we see with the ancient Chinese, for example, the ancient Chinese believed that the source of ideas and intelligence was associated with one of the bodily organs called the spleen. And they also made a distinction that the bodily organs were connected somehow to emotions. And to some degree, we know that that is true as well, because we have an amygdala, for example, which you literally can be amplified to cause some fear and also aggression to take place. We also recognize that the liver is the source of emotion and also the spiritual soul for Greek society. One of the things that comes to mind, which is more of a fun story, is that of Greek mythology and regarding Prometheus, for example. Prometheus is the god of fire. He's a titan. And as a result of that, the story goes on to say that he took one of the lightning bolts from Zeus and he gave it to mankind, and that's why he's referred to as the god of fire. And Prometheus is also referred to as being a trickster, and his name actually means forethinker. And as a forethinker, he had some hidden knowledge that he was able to determine would actually change the direction of humankind. And as a result of that, he's referred to as also being good and also possessing evil, kind of a duality within Prometheus. And the reason for that is when mankind was introduced to fire, fire basically allowed us to have all these various creations, from iron, swords, military armament, and so forth, even up to the modern sense. As a result of Prometheus' defiance to Zeus, who didn't want him to do that, Zeus chained him to a mountain. And as punishment, an eagle would eat his liver every single day, and the next day the liver would regenerate and the eagle would return to torment him yet again and eat it before it would grow again. And in essence, what Zeus was doing and why he actually targeted the liver is because it's human emotion. He wanted to inflict pain on him, and he also recognized that it was part of Prometheus' soul. And as a result of Greek mythology, we recognize today that that's not the source of human emotion. But nevertheless, it's what they believed in antiquity. Then we have somewhere around 400, 500 BC, before the Common Era, we have a Greek physician by the name of Hippocrates. And we get the Hippocratic Oath from that whenever you finish medical school and you have to take that oath. And he was the first one to recognize, diagnose, and treat somebody that had a fear of heights. And he called this acrophobia. Acrophobia is still listed in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that we use to classify and also diagnose mental illness. The DSM was created in 1952, and it has a variety of different conditions in there that will give clinicians and psychologists an understanding of how to classify somebody that has a particular said disorder. Then we move into the medieval period, somewhere between 400 and 1400, and we find that the supernatural explanations to explain people's thoughts and behavior return yet again. And we find that even going into the Renaissance period after 1400, I think going up to 1600, we have even more superstition that takes place with Inquisition, is when they started to interrogate people. So we find this sort of thing occurring over and over again. And what happens here is that the Inquisition, which means interrogation, was fueled by the interest of the Catholic Church. And the Inquisition would try to identify people that were witches. And the reason I say that is because they recognized that some witches were good, but some ultimately were bad, and maybe primarily because of heresy and going against church dogma. If you were accused of being a heretic, for example, or even a witch, you had to be put through a very specific test. The first test that they implemented on a person like this was the metal pole test with a spear. They would poke the person that was accused of this crime of witchcraft. If the person didn't bleed and they were unaffected by it, they must have been protected by the devil, and therefore they're a witch. After that, they needed to be tested with the flow test. The flow test basically meant that they would bind their hands and their feet together, and then they would throw them into the river. If the person floated, it meant they were a witch. If the person sank, it meant they were innocent of the witchcraft that they were accused of, but they drowned. For the unfortunate person that passed the flow test, they were then put on a stake, typically in a piazza, and they were burnt alive. And this practice continued until after the Renaissance. And then we see Europe's first asylums being created in Europe. And asylums are basically places where the mentally ill would be sent. And King Henry VIII of England, he used it for political opponents, and he also used it for social castaways and people that were mentally ill, in fact. And it caught the attention of William Shakespeare, a playwright from this time period of the 17th century. And William Shakespeare recognized that St. Mary's of Bethlehem, which is a very popular asylum at this time, was used to house people with these medical conditions and social castaways. And they lived in very deplorable and chaotic conditions, and many of them were even chained to the wall. And it was very dark down there. As a result of this, Shakespeare, along with other people in the community, labeled St. Mary's of Bethlehem Bedlam. And if you ever watch a European film where you hear the term Bedlam, it's usually in the context, or the setting that is, of people that live in noisy and chaotic conditions that distress the mind. We then get to a point in time where we have moral treatment starting to be discussed. And moral treatment is basically saying that we need to give people dignity and respect while we treat them for various conditions. And one of the individuals that led the charge in Europe was Felipe Pinel. And then towards the latter part of the 19th century, we see Dorothy Dix carry on that moral treatment from the 18th century now into the 19th century in America. And that's when she visited many different prisons here, and she discovered that many of these prisoners should not actually be in there. They were actually in there because of mental health conditions, and they were sick. And she made it her lifelong ambition and crusade to open up a variety of homes, well over 40, to basically get people removed from prisons, put into these homes, and they were then given the moral treatment that they deserved, to treat them with humanity, dignity, and respect while they were sick, and even go to great lengths to try to help them to recover to some degree. So we see the moral treatment taking place in Europe and the United States at this point. Then the modern views brings up the medical model. And the medical model is extremely important because we have a German physician and psychiatrist by the name of Emil Kraepelin. And Emil Kraepelin is embracing the medical model, and what he's saying is that we have to diagnose and treat people for various medical conditions, and this is an important premise in the way he approaches people. And he's also the first one to coin the term dementia praecox to refer to premature dementia, that he later renamed schizophrenia, which was formerly referred to as split brain. Emil Kraepelin was also the first one to distinguish between thought disorders of schizophrenia and that of mood disorders, which is depression, or what he referred to as melancholia, and also manic depression, which is referred to as bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder is saying that you go through moments where you have great moments of euphoria or highs, followed by spiraling and very deep valleys of depression. And because you have such extremes, your emotions are always in a state of constant and unwanted flux because you can't control yourself. Then we have a personality psychologist who was a medical doctor in Vienna, Austria, by the name of Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud's an interesting character. One of the things that I read based on his background is not only is he Jewish, but he also wanted to be part of politics, but he wasn't able to, given his background. So he became a medical doctor as a result of it. And that would set the stage for the rest of his life. After he opened up a small medical practice in Vienna, he noticed that many of his clients were having physical symptoms, and as a result of that, he couldn't identify what the causes were. But there was no injury to these people, and he was a neurologist, and he suspected that there was something going on in the nervous system and something to go on with the neurological aspect of that individual, and that's when he started to think about the human brain and the mind, and started to think about the unconscious mind and how it could repress memories that were damaging to the person, and it could also act as a defense mechanism that could act as some type of driver to a particular behavior, even though it's outside one's consciousness. And he said that most of what people experience, if not all of it, is rooted deeply in childhood experiences. And he comes up with an entire school of thought referred to as psychoanalysis. And he takes the Greek word psycho from mind, and he combines it with a modern term at this point called analysis. Hence, psychoanalysis is born. So psychoanalysis is diving deep into the mind to try to uncover lost, hidden memories that are operating unconsciously and driving some type of strange thought process and also strange behavior, rooted in childhood experiences. And he also believes that the royal road of the unconsciousness, which can unlock some of these hidden memories, can be found in dreams. And he talks about that as well. And we'll revisit that at a latter part of the textbook. In the modern view, we start to see that psychotherapy is becoming important. Drug treatment is now being introduced, and also the criteria for diagnosing mental disorders and illnesses. In 1952, the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, was created. We're in our 5th edition now. It's approximately 3 to 4 inches thick. It's a big book, and it diagnoses over 250 different disorders. Now, this process started with Emil Kraepelin, who was already starting as a psychiatrist to diagnose and also classify very specific symptoms as it relates to very specific illnesses like schizophrenia, as an example, and melancholia, and also bipolar disorder. What we find here is that as time goes on, you'll have new disorders that are introduced to the DSM and others that are revised or removed entirely. A good example is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a new version of that called obsessive compulsive gambling disorder. And I suspect with the most recent edition, what I would expect to find in there is that there could be a disorder in there related to technology, but I haven't looked at this time, but I strongly suspect it's going to make its way in there if it already hasn't. And also regarding homosexuality. Homosexuality was listed as a disorder in the DSM, and in 1973 that disorder was no longer recognized as a disorder and it was removed from the DSM. They also say in the textbook that not all clinicians and psychologists agree on the diagnostic and classification of many of these disorders, and it's left up to interpretation. And in fact, if you have an acute fear of spiders, for example, it may not actually be classified as an illness or a phobia, for example, unless you go to great lengths to change everything in your life so you don't have to come in contact with a spider. And most of us, although we might not like spiders, we're not rearranging our entire life. Therefore, it can't be a phobia. Now, we're going to go back to ancient Greece for a moment. And in ancient Greece, what we find is that philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and even Aristotle, they were thinking about a central question that is often talked about even today: the nature of knowledge and how people acquire knowledge. It sounds like a very simple question, but it's very difficult to answer. And Plato, for example, believed that thinking and reflection was the way knowledge presented itself, whereas Aristotle believed that experience was the way we acquired knowledge and developed it. And this was a very important question and also a debate that would go on for many centuries. And when we use our experiences, or when we experience something, we also recognize that we're engaging our senses, and as we're looking at something, seeing something, hearing something, maybe even touching it for texture, heat, cold, we realize that we're acquiring information. And as we acquire that information based on that particular experience that we're trying to understand, we acquire this knowledge. And Socrates, of course, believed that some knowledge was innate or present at birth, which meant that some people had an advantage to know knowledge that other people didn't know or yet have. Quite interesting. Now, we find after that period that by the time we get to John Locke in the 17th century, John Locke basically puts this question to the test, and he basically then says it's both our experience and also our ability to think and reflect on items that allows us to acquire knowledge. And he comes up with the school of empiricism, which basically just incorporates knowledge, thoughts, and experiences together. Now, that might not seem all that important, but it is, and it had significant effects across Western civilization. Just prior to 1690, he writes a book, A Treatise Concerning Civil Government. And what he's saying in his treaty is that the sovereign monarch that has supreme right to rule over its people may not necessarily have that much right as we think, and that people, everyday people, have a natural right to be sovereign in their environments. And this is significant because shortly after he published that in in 1689, in 1690, he then writes an essay concerning human understanding. And in that essay, he then talks about tabula rasa, which is translated from French to English to mean a blank slate. And why is that so significant? What he's saying here is that we are not born with hidden knowledge that only some people have at birth and others don't. He's saying that whether you are a regular person, like a peasant in this time frame, or a king, queen, or an aristocrat, everybody is born with a blank slate. If you think about the whiteboard behind me, if there is no writing on it, it is a whiteboard. And as we acquire information based on our experiences and how we're engaging our senses and thinking and reflecting on this information, that whiteboard, which represents the symbolism behind a blank slate of your mind, starts to naturally fill up with thoughts. And we start to acquire information and we start to acquire knowledge. For Locke, this is a central point in his philosophy. And this philosophy and these two essays, for example, predate the French Revolution that took place in 1789. It's quite revolutionary. In other words, if you're not born with hidden knowledge, a king and a queen have no right to rule over me as much as I have a right to rule over them. Therefore, we're all equal. The only thing that separates us is our experiences are very different, which is a cultural thing too. And as a result of that, some of us will acquire knowledge that other people don't naturally have. But for the most part, we are all born with a blank slate, and our experiences, thinking, and reflection shapes our understanding of our environment and also shapes the very fabric of our cultures that we occupy. So this is an important premise, and even today we recognize the school of empiricism as reflecting that thought process. So it's about human sensation and also perception. So think of it in terms of how we acquire information based on our senses. Now, although psychology would not become a formal science until the latter part of the 1880s, 1879, for example, with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, when he created the first laboratory for psychology and ran its first experimental apparatus, it's Ernst Weber that really starts the process at this point. And it's because we're talking about physics, we're talking about physical properties, how we physically understand light and also sound, for example. And then eventually we would see the school of psychophysics emerge. And psychophysics basically just says, from Gustav Fechner's point of view, that the way we perceive the physical matter is basically a result of the physical matter and how we process it in our mind. We'll go back to that in a moment. But it's the first scientific form of psychology, and it's rooted in understanding our subjective experience with that of our physical senses. So physics is looking at the physical matter, and then psychophysics is the interpretation or our perception of the physical matter, to put it simply. Now, Ernst Weber comes up with the just noticeable difference, and that's where we get the absolute threshold from. And the just noticeable difference from Weber's point of view is that there comes a point in time where there is just consciously now a noticeable difference in the weight of something when it reaches a certain level. We now refer to that as absolute threshold. And everybody's absolute threshold could be different, like hearing, for example, because the younger you are, you typically have better hearing than if you were age 80, as an example. But just take a piece of paper, for example. If you were to take a piece of paper and place it in the palm of your hand, and then take another piece of paper and place it on there, you probably would not notice that there's been any change to the weight of that physical matter produced from the paper. But there comes a point in time where another piece of paper, or maybe another one after that, is going to change your perception because it reaches a certain threshold, and as a result of that, it's now a just noticeable difference. Now Weber was training Gustav Fechner, and eventually Fechner believed that the work that was being pioneered by Ernst Weber would actually be used to create another school of thought called psychophysics. He figured that, okay, we can measure objectively these physical properties with physics and the law of physics, but how do people perceive some of this? And the perception of this is what is now referred to as psychophysics. A classic example here, just to note, which is not in this text edition but was in the previous one, is the example of which is heavier, 1,000 pounds of bricks or 1,000 pounds of feathers. Now we know that 1,000 pounds, regardless if it's feathers or bricks, is still 1,000 pounds. But then you think about the perception psychologically on what we're talking about, and you say, but it's still a feather, and a feather is much lighter than a brick. And that's where you start to have that frustration set in, and you see and you can feel your mind struggling with that. But at the end of the day, we know a pound is a pound regardless if it's a brick or a feather. So he realized that there was now a need to examine people's perception of the physical properties that we're discussing. And Hermann von Helmholtz is really important too. He's kind of like the modern Da Vinci. And the reason I say that is because his accomplishments are legendary, but not always well known like Da Vinci. You know, so for example, he created meteorology, music theory. He also was able to calculate the speed of a neuron, which he calculated at 90 seconds. He also created the first workable telephone long before Alexander Graham Bell. My guess is he wasn't able to make it scalable, and that's why history doesn't typically note him for that, and we usually think about the other central figure that is responsible for creating it. But nevertheless, he's responsible for physics, he's responsible for all these other inventions, and he's quite dynamic. Now we see Wilhelm Wundt, an austere-looking character right here in the frame of this image, and he creates the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in the year 1879. And what he does is he creates an experimental apparatus, and this experimental apparatus is important because what he's doing is he wants to know if somebody hears and becomes conscious of something at the same time, or is there a difference between these two areas. So he creates this experimental apparatus where he has a subject stand and he says, I'm going to drop a ball, and when the ball hits the platform, I want you to press this bell to let me know that you hear it. And then he records the time. And then he does the experiment exactly the same way, but what he changes is the following. He says, when you hear the ball hit the floor, I want you to press the bell when you consciously are able to think about it. And what he found, based on the way the atoms were firing in the mind, or we could even say neurons, he finds that it takes a little bit longer for somebody to become consciously aware of hearing something. And this is important because he was able to differentiate between the two with this experimental apparatus that was now measuring people's abilities to hear and consciously detect something. And it really goes into evolutionary psychology too. And what I mean by that, because evolution means change, what purpose does it serve? Does it allow you to live a little bit longer if you consciously become aware of it a little bit later and you react to something quicker? A classic example is when you're watching a horror film with a brother or sister, maybe even a close friend, and they get up and they go to the bathroom, but they never return back. And as a result of this, you get curious, the movie's scary, you don't want to watch it by yourself, and you start to look for them in the house, and as you call their name, they're not responding. But then all of a sudden they jump out from an area of the house that you didn't see them, and they scare you. And what you'll notice in that example is that you react to the sound of them scaring you first, and you jump backwards perhaps. And then a second later, you process that information and you consciously become aware, oh, it's just you scaring me. Don't do that again. I don't like it and I'm not comfortable. So in that example, you can see, which is consistent with that experimental apparatus by Wundt, that it makes sense that we would react to sound first as opposed to becoming consciously aware of it. Because if it takes longer to become consciously aware, our safety and our life could depend on it. And that's the point that I want to make. So we find that Wundt creates the first psychology laboratory. Now in America, specifically in Cambridge, we have William James, a Harvard professor. He comes up with a textbook which spans 2 volumes, very good book, but also very dense. And it laid the foundation for Harvard and other universities to follow for the School of Psychology to start developing in our country. And even today, many of the people that teach in good universities have a European American ancestry from that perspective. Now, William James is considered to be the the founder of American psychology, and he's responsible for a couple other things too. He taught Mary Calkins, and Mary Calkins is a woman, and Harvard was an all-male school up until 1920, and many of James's graduate students were dropping out of the program because he admitted her into the program. And he finally listened to the president and also the demands made by his graduate students, and he decided to train Mary Calkins in the comfort of his home. And she fulfilled the requirements for a PhD, but the degree was never conferred because it was an all-male school. And Harvard said, well, you did the work, we're not going to give you a PhD, but we'll give you a bachelor's degree instead from Harvard Sister College, and she kindly rejected. Even though she didn't have a degree that was conferred, it was very well understood that she earned it. And as a result of that, she went on to become an accomplished researcher, a professor at a university. She wrote books. She became the first woman president of the American Psychological Association. And Margaret Washburn would finally earn a PhD as a woman, and she would be noted as the first woman to earn and have a degree conferred in psychology as a PhD. In addition to that, we also have a person by the name of G. Stanley Hall, and G. Stanley Hall studied both under Wundt in Germany and also William James at Harvard. He went on to create the first psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. He also created the American Psychological Association, where he served as its first president, and he created the first American Psychology Journal. He also is noted for mentoring and teaching Francis Cecil Sumner, who went on to become the first African American to earn and have a PhD conferred in psychology, and he went on, I believe, to chair the Department of Psychology at Howard University, and he worked on research that focused on racism, I believe, and also equality.